This is lecture 21, and it's the last of my lectures on Moby-Dick. And in this lecture, I'd like to focus more on issues of perspective, but also perception, and finally, issues of language. Those are all weighty terms, and let's see if we can make them resonate in terms of what we know about this book. I've stressed, and anyone who's read the book even casually knows, that Ahab comes across as a kind of dominant, tyrannical force. His authority is felt everywhere in this text, verbally, but morally, spiritually. He's the sort of all-powerful figure of the text. He's the one, the Promethean figure, who rivals with the gods. And yet, he, like every human being, is limited to his own perceptions, his own sense of things. As great as he is, he cannot be greater than himself. He can't be more than he is. That he is saddled with one apparatus, one way of looking at the world, and even though he can impose that on others and make them, Starbuck, Stubb, Flask, all yield to his power, he cannot get beyond himself. And that's why there are a number of interesting sequences. In one passage, Melville says that Ahab challenges the sun. I've already read you a passage of that. If the sun insulted me, I would attack it. But he envies the sun because the sun, of course, is panoptic. The sun sees everything. Nothing is dark for the sun. There's no point, no place that the sun cannot see. Whereas Ahab knows that when the sun goes down, it's dark. He can't see. Of course, the sun never goes down if you're the sun. The sun is just somewhere else. And so he envies that kind of totalizing vision that the sun has, knowing that he only has partial vision. He's the text's great monomaniac and great monovocalist. He only has his voice. He really has one recurring phrase, kind of slogan, that is heard over and over when the Pequod meets other boats, which is, "Hast seen the white whale?" That's the only question that matters to him. Now, mind you, there are other questions that one might ask. I mean, after all, the ocean is really a kind of information highway. There are boats going back and forth. They meet a number of other boats here. There's life on those boats. There's people on those boats. Ahab has absolutely no interest in any of that. All of it gets boiled down, distilled into one overriding concern: has seen the white whale. Ships passing in the night, essentially. Ahab envies the whale. I've already alluded to the fact, and you all know it, that whales have eyes on the sides of their head. And there's some brilliant language in the text about that. Therefore, whales cannot see what's coming at them. They cannot see what's in front of them, like we can. Everything that's in front of them or behind them is invisible. On the other hand, they can see what's on both sides of them, which we cannot. And the text emphasizes that we are all locked in that way, that the very premise of focusing on something, visually but also conceptually, the price we pay is not to focus on something else. We ourselves are locked into this singling apparatus, whereas the whale could in fact focus on two distinct things, something on the left and something on the right at the same time. And he goes on to say, what an intriguing brain that must be. A brain that can be multiple, that can actually have dual directions, dual outlets. And I'd like to use that as a kind of model for what I think Melville is up to, which is to produce a text that is commensurate with the multiple perspectives of the world. That's why he's chosen a ship and not just a monologue. Ahab dominates, but the book is more than Ahab. The book is also the other people on this boat. We return then to Ishmael. Ishmael's wonderful voice, Ishmael's rendering of things, Ishmael's job as essentially the narrator who takes the measure of Ahab, although he cannot take the measure. And there's also a sense of the simple pleasures of conversation, which of course Ahab, as you can well imagine, is not a scintillating conversationalist. Has seen the white whale, that sort of is the beginning and the end. Whereas Melville manages to let us know something about the actual human drama on some of the boats that pass. And one of the most delightful sequences is when they have this conversation on board this English boat, the Samuel Enderby, and it turns out that the captain on this boat, a Captain Boomer, has been damaged in a kind of parallel way to Ahab. He has an ivory arm and Ahab has an ivory leg. It's this weird kind of ballet between these two figures. But this character Boomer is a big talker, and so they're talking about the wound that he got and how it turns out that Moby-Dick is the one that gave it to him. But unlike Ahab, who was furiously in hot pursuit of Moby-Dick, Boomer has had enough. And there's a conversation, particularly between Boomer and his doctor, Bunger. And so he tells Ahab what they've been doing. Ahab is on their boat. Drinking hot rum toddies with me every night. This is what the doctor did with him when he fixed up his, amputated his arm and put on the other one. Till he couldn't see to put on the bandages, sending me to bed, half seas over about 3 o'clock in the morning. Oh, ye stars, he sat up with me indeed and was very severe in my diet. Oh, great watcher, very dietetically severe, is Dr. Bunger. Bunger, you dog, laugh out, why don't you? You know you're a precious jolly rascal. But heave ahead, boy, I'd rather be killed by you than kept alive by any other man. At this point, Bunger comes into the conversation. My captain, you must have ere perceived this, respected sir, said the imperturbable, godly-looking Bunger, slightly bowing to Ahab. My captain is apt to be facetious at times. He spins us many clever things of that sort, but I may as well say, en passant, as the French remark, that I myself, that is to say Jack Bunger, late of the Reverend clergy, am a strict total abstinence man. I never drink water, says the captain. He never drinks it. It's a sort of fit to him. Fresh water throws him into hydrophobia. But go on with the arm story. And you can feel the geniality of Melville as he plays out this conversation of this doctor and this captain. And the guy's lost an arm. It could be material for tragic conversation, but it's not. What you feel is the bonhomie, the warmth of these two figures. This is what this book has no room for. I mean, the book has it. Ahab has no room for it. He's going mad as he's listening to them talk about all of this business about how they treated the arm and the relationship between the doctor and the patient. All he wants to know about is the whale. Finally, he more or less explodes, Ahab does, and says, he's all a magnet. How long since thou sawest him? Which way heading? At this point, the doctor says, bless my soul, and curse the foul fiends, cried Bunger, stoopingly walking around Ahab and like a dog sniffing Ahab. This man's blood. Bring the thermometer. It's at the boiling point. His pulse makes these planks beat, sir. And, of course, Ahab explodes. Avast! Man the boats. Which way heading? That's the only thing he has in mind. So the book manages to tell you what's lacking in the monomaniacal, single-vision madness of Ahab. And I think in that light, the book demonstrates the trumps of narrative literature, that the novel is capacious. It can host, it's inclusive. It hosts many different voices, including the voice of the monomaniac, but that's not the only voice. So it's in that sense that perspective gets its due, and that there are pleasures of stereophony. There are pleasures of many voices, social pleasures, verbal pleasures. That's part of the richness of the human community. And that's essentially, as I said, what's ruled out by Ahab. And yet, not by Melville. In some of the most fascinating chapters of this book, he takes the measure of, he's wonderfully theatrical. He gives us a series of different perspectives on the single issues. One of them, as we've already seen, is the whale. Ahab regards the whale as the incarnation of evil. But Starbuck says, how could you possibly do that? And we know that Flask and Stubb, the other people on the boat, see it still differently. There's another chapter that is very well known, which is the chapter of the doubloon, which is one of the most sort of exemplary illustrations of this. At this point, Ahab has sort of hung up this Spanish doubloon, and that is what people are going to look at as this coin that they would get if whoever is going to be most useful in catching the whale. And this coin has a number of markings on it. It says that you could see the likeness of 3 Andes summits. From one there was a flame, a tower on another, on a third a crowing cock, and there was a segment of the partition zodiac. And there was a lot of sort of Kabbalistic notations that no one knows how to interpret. Well, you can imagine what grist for Melville's mill that is. Every person on the boat is going to walk in front of this doubloon and offer their interpretation. It's a kind of perspectival parade. Needless to say, Ahab takes honors here. He's the first one. What does he see when he looks at that doubloon? The firm tower, that is Ahab. The volcano, that is Ahab. The courageous, the undaunted, and victorious fowl, that too is Ahab. All are Ahab. And this round gold is but the image of the rounder globe, which, like a magician's glass, to each and every man in turn, but mirrors back his own mysterious self. So for Ahab, everything is a mirror. Everything is his own monstrous egocentrism, his own monstrous plan. But of course, the others won't see it that way. Starbuck looks at this, a dark valley between the three mighty heaven-abiding peaks that almost seem the Trinity in some faint earthly symbol. So in this veil of death, God girds us round, and over all our gloom, the sun of righteousness still shines a beacon and a hope. So he puts a Christian interpretation on the icon. And then Stubb, who's the funniest character in the book, comes in and looks at it, and he watches these two, Ahab and Starbuck. Now there's the old mogul, he's been twigging it, and there goes Starbuck from the same, and both with faces which I should say might be somewhere within 9 fathoms long. They haven't liked what they've looked at. And all from looking at a piece of gold, which, did I have it now on Negro Hill or in Corlayer's Hook, I'd not look long at it very at all before spending it. So for him, this thing is something you could take and spend. He then looks at the signs of the zodiac, and he treats us to a beautiful speech about what that zodiac means. To begin, there's Aries of the ram, lecherous dog. He begets us. Then Taurus of the bull. He bumps us, the first thing. Then Gemini or the twins, that is virtue and vice. We try to reach virtue, but lo, comes Cancer, the crab, and drags us back. And here, going from virtue, Leo, a roaring lion, lies in the path. He gives us a few bites and surly dabs with his paw. We escape, and hail Virgo, the virgin. That's our first love. We marry and think to be happy, for aye, when pop comes Libra, or the scales, happiness weighed and found wanting. And while we are very sad about that, Lord, how suddenly we jump as Scorpio or the scorpion stings us in rear. We are curing the wound when whang come the arrows all around. Sagittarius of the archer is amusing himself, and as we pluck out the shaft, stand aside. Here's the battering ram, Capricornus of the goat. Full tilt he comes rushing, and headlong we're tossed when Aquarius, or the water-bearer, pours out his whole deluge and drowns us, and to wind up with Pisces, or the fishes, we sleep. He, of course, speaks the plot of the novel. That's where they're all going to wind up. But it's a just lovely voice that we haven't heard enough of that gives us its own homespun interpretation of these esoteric symbols of the zodiac and turns it really into a kind of philosophy of life, of what attends us from birth to death. That's part, again, as I said, of the perspectival really fireworks of this book. And others come and try their hand at interpreting the doubloon. One of the most interesting interpretations is that of Pip, Pip the idiot. He looks at it, and what do you think? And Ahab is watching him. What do you think he says? I look, you look, he looks. We look, ye look, they look. Ahab is very confused. It's upon my soul. He's been studying Murray's grammar, improving his mind, poor fellow. But what's that he says now? I look, you look, he looks. We look, ye look, they look. Why, he's getting it by heart. Listen again. I look, you look, he look. And it's a marvelous moment where this text turns into a kind of grammatical, I think, cubistic exercise. You realize that that's what this book is. I look, you look, he looks. We look, ye look, they look. That's the world. That's the perceptual game of life. And it will look different depending on whether it's I, you, he, we, ye, they. And the book wants to freight that in, except that Pip doesn't even put his own stamp on it. He just gives us the raw structure of it. That's why I say it's the grammar itself that comes forth. Pip, however, does say a little bit more than that. Ahab is listening to it, and he knows that Pip is his nemesis in some way, as well as his alter ego. He's too crazy witty for my sanity, Ahab says. So I leave him muttering, and here's what he mutters. Here's the ship's navel, Pip says, this doubloon here, and they are all on fire to unscrew it. Unscrew the ship's navel. But unscrew your navel, and what's the consequence? What happens if you unscrew your navel? Well, the consequence, the notes tell us, it's part of folklore, is if you unscrew your navel, your backside falls off, okay? And this is an interesting commentary on the processes of perception and interpretation, getting lost in semiosis in the way in which meanings are made, and we lose our substance. There is no substance left. There's just the interpretive dynamics, the interpretive machinery, the I, you, he, we, ye, they. I think that that's part of the dispossession, the losing of one's backside or one's front side or one's substance is part of what this book is ultimately pointing towards. There is a lot of humor in this as well. I mean, we need to hear these voices because this is otherwise such a confining text. Ahab, in his own way, is a kind of imprisoning voice. As he does to the people on the boat, so he does to the reader, which is to overwhelm us with the power of his own sort of mad vision. And so, in a sense, there's a lot of comic relief to bring these other perspectives in, as well as a checking alternative point of view, as in Starbuck with his Christian perspective. There are many instances. I've mentioned the doubloon. I had mentioned earlier the very meaning of the whale. There are scenes, for example, of where they look in the sea and they come forth with really rigorously different interpretations. It's as if Melville wants to illuminate this interpretive activity, wants to see that all of us have our own machinery there. And even at the end of the book, when they're dying, when they're going into the water to meet their death, that same kind of perceptual game is played. We have Starbuck getting ready to die. My God, stand by me now. And the very next line is, stand not by me, but stand under me, whoever you are, that will now help Stubb, because Stubb doesn't have the same exalted point of view that Starbuck does. The novel pirouettes. It takes its givens, including the moment of death, and lets you see them as a game or as something that will look different depending on whether it's I, you, he, we, ye, and they. Now that, as I said, is one of the great pleasures of narrative literature. I call it a pleasure because it's something we're not equipped to do on our own. Ahab, like we, is locked into a single mindset. Art is one way of extending our mindset, of traveling in someone else's field of vision, of having access to fields of vision that in life we don't have access to. On the other hand, this book, at its, I think, most sort of exalted and most adventurous, challenges even that perspective. It challenges the notion that there is a perspective. It moves towards erasure. And that's where I think the book becomes really the most, the most impudent and the most sort of troubling novel of the 19th century. It looks very much like a modern text in its passages. And I'm obviously alluding to the very famous chapter, which is called The Whiteness of the Whale, which is the most famous chapter, the philosophical nugget or core of the book. And it happens fairly early, about a third of the way through. And it's Ishmael sort of speculating about what the whale might mean. Not now in terms of Ahab's maniacal pursuit, but in a more philosophical vein of what this, particularly the whiteness of the whale. And he starts this chapter by saying that we know that whiteness is a very firm notion in most of our traditional iconic systems. White represents innocence, it represents purity. People wear white in clothing, particular professions, nurses, etc. And that he wants, for us to realize that cultures and religions have fixed these terms. He goes on to say that white, however, for him speaks horror and not innocence or purity or anything like that. And he calls it the absence of all color, which of course we know from a painterly point of view that that's the case. I'll read you the great closing passage of this. It's one of the richest things in American literature, it seems to me, in any literature. And it says a great deal about what is so horrifying about white. Is it that by its indefiniteness it shadows forth the heartless voids and immensities of the universe, and thus stabs us from behind with the thought of annihilation, so that white is erasure of us. It's the immensity of the universe, but also the voids. Or is it that in essence, whiteness is not so much a color as the visible absence of color, and at the same time the concrete of all colors? It's for these reasons that there's such a dumb blankness, and we're moving into real Melville territory here, a blankness. Dumb blankness, full of meaning in a wide landscape of snow. So what do you think when you see a landscape of snow? A colorless all color of atheism from which we shrink absence of any design, any pattern, any meaning, just blankness. And when we consider that other theory of the natural philosophers, that all other earthly hues, every stately or lovely emblazoning, think of this, the world we see is a world filled with color, the sweet tinges of sunset skies and woods, the gilded velvets of butterflies, the butterfly cheeks of young girls, how his palette now moves from the sunset to the actual blush of youth that people have. These are all subtle deceits, not actually inherent in substances, but laid on from without, that light creates this, that light gives color to things, that they don't intrinsically have it. Here is the theatrical vision taken to the extreme now. Pasteboard mask. The color world that we all see with our eyes that is so fresh and beautiful, that marks the things that are meaningful to us. All of this is going to be essentially indicted as a kind of deceit, as a fraud, as an illusion. So that all deified nature absolutely paints like the harlot. It's mascara. It's paint. It's not inherent in anything, whose allurements cover nothing but the charnel house within. Here is the cannibalizing vision. I see you and I see the skeleton that you're going to be. I see your ruddiness, your health. All of that is a fraud. It's a facade. I can see through it to the structure beneath, the charnel house. And when we proceed further and consider that the mystical cosmetic which produces every one of her hues, the great principle of light, forever remains white or colorless in itself, he then goes on to produce a vision of the world as leprous. The palsied universe lies before us like a leper. And like willful travelers in Lapland who refuse to wear colored and coloring glasses upon their eyes, so the wretched infidel gazes himself blind at the monumental white shroud that wraps all the prospect around him. It is a very, I think, moving, profound meditation about color and light, as I said, as cosmetics. I use the word cannibalize. I said that cannibalism is the threat of the early adventure stories of Typee. Cannibalism is what he first suspects when he sees Queequeg. Cannibalism now becomes a feature of vision. I look and I see the charnel house within. In Melville's best work, vision is cannibalizing. He uses the constant motif of light. He's writing about a decade before the Impressionist paintings begin to occur. And we know that light is the constitutive structuring principle of those paintings. Now, I want to make one small leap. What I think Melville is telling us is that human thought and human imagination are the mind's light. That human thought is exercised upon the world and it erodes the world. It's I look at things and I see through them. That is the project of this text. At times, that is a magnificent, inspiriting project. That all of the objects in this text I look at and I see the spirit within them. That's the Emersonian model. I can see the range of magnificent meanings and imaginative possibilities in the poor phenomenal world. But this project also becomes mad in this text as well. That thinking is understood in its modern sense also as a disease of consciousness that erodes everything that it looks at, that cannot find any substance at all. That the mascara and the subtle deceits come to be seen as really the very ornaments of human thought. It's the way the mind works. Now let's think about this if we sort of move towards a conclusion in this text. Moby-Dick, the white whale, is essentially the object that can never be captured, either by Ahab or by language. All of these, and that's why he's white. It resists any of these sort of corralling, domesticating procedures that would somehow access the world for us and allow us to possess it. That's why this book is one long, extended pursuit. It's an epistemological quest, it's a moral quest, it's a verbal quest to somehow get the whale. And it won't happen. The whale is frequently, as his body rises through the water, described in phallic terms. Ahab is the person who has been wounded. Ahab is the person, he says, gifted with the high perception, I lack the low enjoying power. Ahab is wounded later in the book when his ivory leg all but pierces him through the groin, is what Melville writes. There's definitely a fable here of potency and impotency. There's a sense in which the human project can never take the measure, map, and possess the energies of the world. It can't be done. And I think that we have to see this book as a series of frenzied approaches. There's one whole chapter in this book about the way in which the whale has been misperceived. All the false names given to the whale. But the true name of the whale, like the true name of God, cannot be spoken. That's a face we can never see. Just like he could describe the tail of the whale in that passage I alluded to, but never the head. So that Moby-Dick is not going to be possessible. And I want us to reflect on that. This is what is so modern about this. This book is about the project of interpretation, the project of deciphering, the project of semiosis. That is to say, all of the meanings that come out of the world, that we look at and we project meanings onto it. We interpret, we decode, but we can't get to the things themselves. That's what Kant said, das Ding an sich. We can't get to the things. They exist, Moby-Dick exists, and here we are with all of our apparatus, with our fine ships, our harpoons. We can't get to them, and our language. This book is a kind of frenzied, brilliant, magnificent, epic effort to get to, but it never gets to. It can't be done. The doubloon, you interpret it all these different ways. You unscrew your navel. You lose your substance. It's a parable about interpretation. It's about the art of incompletion. I'm going to read you a passage, a very strange passage, where he talks about his own book and about his own project. He compares it. He says, "But now I leave my cetological system," cetology is the science of whales, "I leave my cetological system standing thus unfinished, even as the great cathedral of Cologne was left with the crane still standing upon the top of the uncompleted tower." And hear his language. "For small erections may be finished by their first architects. Grand ones, true ones, ever leave the copestone to posterity. God keep me from ever completing anything. This whole book is but a draft. Nay, but the draft of a draft. Oh, time, strength, cash, and patience." You really hear Herman Melville there. That's not Ishmael. That's not Ahab. That's the writer. That's the writer who understands that the art of incompletion applies to writing books as well as to building cathedrals. I think that notation of small erection says that no human being, even a monomaniacal Ahab, can ever be possessed of the potency that would allow you to possess the world, to capture it. All you can do is strive for it, reach for it. And I also think that those four terms that he gives us as the conditions of his own incompleteness, time, strength, cash, and patience, it brings this high-flying, metaphysical text wonderfully back to earth. These are the constraining facts of life that any writer lives with and dies with. Time, strength, cash, and patience. These are the impediments that dog human life. Not just the inherent problems of language being commensurate with its objects that it seeks to describe, but also the pragmatic, physical, somatic, real, economic, social impediments that make life an art of incompletion for all of us. Will he live long enough to finish this book? This has a kind of terrible pathos when one thinks that this is the book that, as it were, sinks Melville. This is the book from which his reputation will be lost. He will be essentially underwater after this. So that the book closes. Our passage I just read you is not the end. The book closes, of course, with the very wonderful, famous lines by Ishmael, who cites Job, "And I only am escaped alone to tell thee." Everyone goes under except Ishmael, who is rescued. And that perhaps is the most positive way to conclude this, which is to say that the narrative voice is the voice of the one surviving orphan. He's the person who floats still and is picked up and comes back to tell us the story. The rest of them have all died. The project fails. Moby-Dick is not caught. He cannot be named. And yet, Ishmael lives. It is a wonderful statement about art, narrative. Narrative is an orphaned voice. The people that it describes are long dead, but the voice, the script, the language lives on. Ahab, the whale, they are in fact named. They're named in their incompleteness, but they're named in the text. That lives. Thank you.